At first, I was simply trying not to drown. Then one day, I realized I was swimming. Maybe I could actually do this job. Welcome to the Knowing Moments. I'm your host, Joy Chick. This is a space where we explore the quiet inflection points in life and career. The moments when something shifts internally before clarity and change follow. In the last episode, I shared what it felt like to step into a role where I was completely out of my depths. But today is about what happened next. Because eventually, things that once felt overwhelming slowly started to feel manageable. The pressure didn't go away, but I started to grow into it. Today's episode is called Learning to Swim, and it's about what happens when survival only slowly turns into confidence. Leading a big team like Identity, back then, almost 1,000 people. We had these team-wide meetings twice a year. We called them all hands. A few months after I was announced as a new leader, the team organized one. It was my first real moment in front of everyone, an opportunity for the entire org to meet me, hear my vision, my strategy, and decide quietly what they thought of me. This was also back in the days when we were all in office like 5 days a week. So this wasn't a virtual town hall. This was a room, a huge conference room full of people. I still remember the days leading up to it. I was just so nervous. I had barely started in the role. It was actually really hard for me to articulate the business strategy in my own words. So we made a decision. Our head of product would go deep on strategy, and I would stay high level. And honestly, that felt terrible. I was so used to being the expert in the room, the person who could go deep on any topic. And suddenly, I wasn't that person anymore. Leading a team without being able to explain everything in detail. And it made me feel vulnerable and frankly a little inadequate. The rest of the agenda was more straightforward, celebrating anniversaries, team achievements, the usual things. So there I was, walking onto the stage, looking out at the crowd, hundreds of people, thousands of eyes, laser focused, completely silent, waiting. You could almost hear a pin drop. And suddenly, my heart just started racing. And I remember thinking, okay, this is it. I am about to make a complete fool of myself. And with that, I started. Welcome to the Identity Team All Hands. Honestly, the rest of that meeting is a blur now. But there's one moment I remember very clearly. I'm 5 feet tall. And most of my leadership team, they all over 6 foot tall. So picture this, a petite woman leading this massive organization, standing in the role of very tall man. During Q&A, instead of sitting, I leaned against this very high stool because sitting made me feel even smaller. For a moment, I felt almost invisible. Years later, one of my direct reports actually told me something that I'll never forget. He said, Joy, I still remember that first all hands. And if I'm being honest, you weren't very good. And then he smiled, but wow, you come a long way. He was right. When I look back on that very first all hands, and how I slowly became more comfortable with public speaking, I realize how a leader shows up in these moments does matter. You have to project confidence, even when you don't feel it. You have to create clarity, even when you are still figuring things out. And most importantly, you have to inspire. Getting the job, that's just a beginning. Earning trust, earning respect, that happens over time. When I first stepped into the identity leadership role, I inherited a very experienced team. A lot of senior leaders, people who have been in the space for a long time. And in many ways, they knew the business better than I did. And early on, we started doing something together as a leadership team. At our leadership meeting, we had a recurring session that's called Roses and Thorns. Each of us would come prepared. Roses means what's going on well, and thorns, what's not working. It was an honest and open discussion, sometimes even uncomfortable. Early on, I really liked it because it created space for truth. It felt like a healthy team. But over time, I started noticing something. We had great discussions. Everyone agreed on the problems. But when the session ended, there were no clear next steps, no owners, which means no change on the thorns. And slowly, what looked like honesty began to feel like repetition and with no real progress. And that was a hard realization for me because I liked the concept, but I also knew we were moving the ship forward. At the same time, I was still in that what I called listening mode. Observe, learn, understand the dynamics. Who steps up? Who drives solutions? And who identifies problems but doesn't take ownership? Patterns started to emerge very quickly. That's when leadership challenge became real for me. Because now it wasn't about understanding the business. It was about reshaping the team. I remember thinking, if I don't change my leadership team, nothing will change. But these weren't junior people. These were senior leaders, respected, well-established. I had always believed in a principle that you may have heard. A players bring A players. B players bring C players. And culture compounds. So I started sketching different models, different ways to restructure the leadership team. And I talked through ideas with my chief architect, testing my thinking. Because the stakes were high. This wasn't a small change. This was changing the leadership team of a 1,000-people organization. It would impact the business, the culture, a lot of individuals. And once you start something like that, you can't undo it easily. I remember describing it this way. We need heart surgery, not a Band-Aid. I was also very conscious of something else. You can't change everything at once. Organizations can only absorb so much shock. So this wasn't just about what to change. It was also about how fast. And then came on one of the hardest moments, the night before the announcement. One of the most senior executives in the company came to me and he said, Joy, I respect your decision, but I think you are making a big mistake. And that moment stayed with me because it introduced doubt, real doubt from someone I respected deeply. And I remember asking myself, did I miss something? Am I moving too fast? Is this the wrong call? But at the end of the day, I came back to the same place. We needed to change, so I moved forward. And like most big leadership decisions, the positive impact didn't show up immediately. There was disruption, adjustment, uncertainty, but over time, things started to shift. The level of ownership increased. The pace of execution improved. And years later, I would hear something that made me pause. People would say, Joy, what you did with that org change, that was bold. And things really started to improve after you made that move. Looking back, that experience taught me something important about leadership. Listening is critical, but at some point, you have to act. Creating space for honesty matters. But without ownership, honesty alone doesn't drive progress. And maybe most importantly, leadership is not just about inheriting a team. It's about building the team the future requires. Because when you are learning to swim, at some point, you have to stop observing the water and jump in. Identity is one of the most critical infrastructures in the Microsoft Cloud. And I used to say this half jokingly, but also very seriously. When we sneeze, we create a tsunami in the world. Because when identity goes down, nothing works. People can't log in. Hospitals, emergency systems, businesses, everything depends on it. This is not a job for the faint of heart. Over the years, we had our share of major incidents, the kind that make headlines. Microsoft services down worldwide. Users unable to access email. Critical systems disrupted. And every single time, it's gut-wrenching. Because you know exactly what it means for customers and their customers. There's one incident from my early days in the role that I still remember vividly. It started with a DNS routing issue. Okay, I got a little bit too deep here. At first, it looked like a technical hiccup, but very quickly, we realized it locked out everyone from their accounts, their systems, everyone's whole digital life. And suddenly, we were in what I would call the fog of war. Different teams were troubleshooting different layers. Some were testing recovery options. Others were forming new theories. Everything was just happening at once. The pressure was intense. And customer calls were coming in nonstop. When will this be fixed? What's the status? How bad is this? And leaders across Microsoft were reaching out because their services depended on us. Everyone was moving fast, trying to solve it. I was a leader of the division, just standing in the middle of it and feeling helpless. Because I wasn't the one at the keyboard. I wasn't debugging code. The engineer in me wanted to jump in, to fix it, to do something concrete. But that wasn't my role anymore. So I had to ask myself in a different question. Given the situation, what is the best value I can add right now? And that question changed everything. I started to re-engage, not by doing the work directly, but by thinking alongside the team, forming hypotheses, asking the right questions. And at the same time, I focused on something equally important, setting expectations with leaders across the company. I remember saying very clearly, this might be a bad one and it's going to take time. That honesty mattered because in moments like this, clarity is as important as speed. As night went on, hours passed. At some point, I called my fiance. Hey, can you bring us some food? And within 20 minutes, he showed up with bags of takeout. Exhausted and hungry, we sat together in a circle, eating Mediterranean food with plastic utensils. And for a moment, a brief break. It felt like college again. You know those nights before a big final project is due? Everyone's tired, a little stressed, but also together. That moment didn't solve the incident, but it did something else. It bonded us as a team. Because in those high pressure moments, you see how people show up and you learn something about leadership. As a leader, you don't always fix a problem directly. Sometimes your role is to stay calm when everything feels chaotic. Sets priority by simply showing up, supporting the team without getting in their way. And most importantly, you stay. Because your presence matters more than you think. You're not just solving the incident. You're shaping how the team experiences it. And in many ways, those are the moments where teams are truly built. Because when you are learning to swim, it's one thing to practice in calm water. It's another when you are thrown into the deep water in the middle of a storm. And that's when you really learn how to lead. As a leader of a business, my role went from almost completely internal to being very external facing. I still remember my very first customer trip overseas a few months into the role. Germany. The team lined up almost 15 customer meetings over several days. Every industry was represented. These weren't just customers. These were iconic global brands I admired. I was genuinely excited to walk into their offices, to meet their leadership teams. It felt like an honor. But underneath that excitement, there was something else. Fear. I remember thinking, have I learned enough to represent the business well? What if I don't have every answer? And then there were quieter thoughts. Will they trust me? Will they respect me? And yes, I was worried about language and the cultural differences too. So I prepared a lot. I studied the detailed briefing docs the team built, asked many questions. I even prepared multiple versions of presentations, just in case. And then the first meeting. I walked into the conference room, and there were over 20 people already waiting, smiling. Welcome, Joy. We're so excited to have you here. The meeting started quickly, smoother than I expected, and I found my rhythm. And then what I feared, in one of the sessions, a customer asked a very direct question. Joy, the feature we deployed, it didn't work for us. Why? And for a split second, I froze because I didn't know the details of that specific issue. I almost panicked. Before I could respond, one of my product leaders stepped in. He said, "Thank you for raising that. Let me ask a few questions so we can understand what happened. And just like that, the meeting became very collaborative. People on both sides leaned in, and I realized I didn't need to have every answer. What mattered more? How we work through the problem together. That moment actually built more trust than if we had a perfect answer. Over those few days in Germany, meeting customers after customers, I learned so much about them and how they use our products. But even more importantly, I learned how trust is built, not through slides or perfect answers, but through conversation, through showing up and following through, honestly and openly. Credibility comes from listening well, admitting what you don't know, and bring the right people into the conversation. Years later, I found myself keynoting at conferences, standing on stages in front of thousands of people, speaking with confidence about our business, our strategy, our vision. That confidence didn't come from a single moment. It came from iteration, from showing up even when I wasn't fully ready. That's how you learn to swim. Not by waiting for confidence on dry land, but by stepping into the water and building confidence one stroke at a time. As I reflect on those early years, a few learning moments stand out. Not as big dramatic realizations, but as patterns that only became clear over time. Learning number one, you don't need to be the expert to lead. In the beginning, that was the hardest shift for me. I was used to being the one with answers, the one who could go deep. But leadership at scale is different. It's not about knowing everything. It's about creating the conditions where the best answers can emerge. Sometimes that means asking the right questions. Sometimes that means bringing the right people into the room. And then sometimes it means being comfortable not knowing. Learning number two, progress requires moving from observation to action. Listening is important. Understanding is important. But at some point, you have to decide, you have to act, and you have to shape the team, the culture, the path forward. Because even the most honest conversations don't create change. Learning number three, in high pressure moments, presence matters more than control. During the crisis, during uncertainty, you don't always fix a problem directly, but you show up, you stay calm, you create clarity, and you stay with your team. Because how you show up in those moments shapes how the team experiences them. And learning number four, confidence is built through repetition, not readiness. I didn't feel ready for my first all hands. I didn't feel ready for my first customer visit. I didn't feel ready for many of those moments. But I showed up anyway. And over time, those experiences compounded into knowledge and expertise. Confidence doesn't come first, it follows. Looking back now, those early years felt overwhelming, sometimes even scary. But they were also some of the most important years of my growth because they forced me to expand, to lead differently. And when you're in that phase, it often feels like you're just trying to survive, like you're barely keeping your head above water. But what you don't realize in the moment, you are learning how to swim. So if you find yourself in a moment like that right now, where you don't feel fully ready, where you are questioning whether you belong, maybe it's just a sign that you are exactly where growth is happening. Because the moments that stretch us the most are often the ones that prepare us for what comes next. And when you know, you know. If this episode resonates with you, please subscribe, rate, and review the Knowing Moments wherever you get your podcasts. And sign up for updates at theknowingmoments.com/email. And if someone came to mind while listening, please share this podcast with them. You can share and tag us on your social posts. We are The Knowing Moments on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And send your feedback and suggestions for future episodes to joy@theknowingmoments.com as we continue this journey together. In the next episode, we will explore what happens when success slowly turns into inertia. This is The Knowing Moments. I'm Joy Chick. Thank you for being here.